My name's Bryan, and I usually do service with my wife Carmenza, who's at home with a little bit of a back injury that's on the mend, but not quite there. So Devaki has graciously volunteered to help me. Thank you so much. This is a reading from Rays of the One Light, which are weekly commentaries on the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. This is week 32, Does God Hide the Truth? Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. In last week's reading, we saw that the great masters themselves counseled discretion in the dissemination of truth. The counter-argument is sometimes made, but the Lord doesn't hide. He reveals His beauty in the sunsets, His tender sympathy in the rain, His wrath in the thunder, His restless energy in the brooks, His power in the sunlight. There are exoteric truths, and there are also esoteric truths. There is that which is revealed impersonally and left up to us to interpret, such as the thunder and our perception of it as divine wrath, the rain and our perception of it as God's sympathy. But behind even God's most open expressions, there lies impenetrable mystery. The wind blows where it wills, said Jesus in chapter 3 of the Gospel of St. John. You hear the sound of it, but you do not know where it comes from or where it is going. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. And Sri Krishna says in the 9th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, by me the whole vast universe of things is spread abroad. By me the unmanifest. In me are all existences contained, not I in them. God's hidden reality cannot be understood by the reasoning faculty. India's Sankhya philosophy states frankly, Ishwar Ashidha, God is not provable. A willingness to seek the underlying reality behind appearances is essential for those who would know God. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind, and quietly, Om, Om, Om. Does God hide the truth? I always come to mind with this expression, hidden in plain sight. And it reminds me of this cartoon that I saw of Moses, who's just received a package. And the package is the 10 Commandments on the 2 tablets. And it comes in a box like our Amazon boxes, and it's marked fragile because they're stone, and it's wrapped in bubble wrap. And so Moses is standing there holding these 2 tablets, and all of his gurubais, all of his friends, are running over and popping the bubble wrap. And Moses is standing there saying, would you guys just stop for 5 seconds and look at these things? It's so much like that about us having to move beyond sense distractions as a first step for being able to explore the mysteries that are hidden in plain sight from us. Because Swami tells us in this reading that these are esoteric truth. And esoteric by definition means that only a few can have access to them. And fortunately, we have a guru to help us with that very task. We have a line of gurus, we have a teachings. One piece of the Vedic teachings that might be helpful in thinking about what is true, especially in our current climate where we think that it's truth about some external realities or, some kind of truth that we could find buried somewhere on Facebook. But the teaching is about the three gunas. I'll try not to use too many Sanskrit words here, but God has imbued everything in creation with three qualities or attributes or gunas, and they're at different spiritual levels. Sattva is the elevating or uplifting or spiritually clarifying energy. Rajas is the activating energy, the movement and doing something energy. And tamas is really not doing much of anything. It's a degrading energy or a darkening energy. And Yogananda says that there are whole galaxies that are predominantly one of these attributes. And he says that our own galaxy, the Milky Way, is predominantly a Rajasic galaxy. So our consciousness is prone to being Rajasic. Thank goodness we're not in a galaxy, not this time around, that is tamasic. So remember when we were kids how much fun it was to play this game where you would always answer a question with a question? I thought it might be fun to do that with this does God hide the truth question. Because each of these attributes has a corresponding way of asking a question in the pursuit of truth. And so sattvic question is, remember that's the elevating energy. The sattvic question in any situation is, what's trying to happen here that we're striving towards understanding? The rajasic or activating energy question is, what's happening? What's up? What's up, man? What's new? ¿Qué tal? ¿Qué hay? What's the deal? That's the questioning that is having that energy of rajas. And then the tamasic question is kind of like when you've woken up from an afternoon nap and something's going on and you're like, what happened? What happened? So in the midst of this cataclysm that we may be in with the pandemic, the floods, the fires, the wars, we probably should be seeking the truth about this difficulty that we're in by asking the most sattvic question we can, which is, what is trying to happen? Paramahansa Yogananda wrote in 1936, quote, "No one can get away with disturbing one part of the world without the disturbance moving through the ether waves to other parts of the world." And he goes on to talk about World War I, because this is in the mid-30s, and World War II hadn't happened yet. World War I created wrong vibrations in Europe first, that then spread all over the earth. And where there was no war, influenza appeared. The agonies of the people who died in the war created the subtle cause of the epidemic of Spanish influenza, which immediately followed the war and killed 20 million people, while the war itself killed only 10 million people. He also talked about the Spanish Civil War, which was happening in the mid-1930s with the fascists' sort of reign of terror that was happening in Spain. He said the Spanish Civil War death struggles, particularly of women and children, are causing floods in America, storms in England and Portugal, and earthquakes in India. So we don't have Yogananda to tell us about what's happening now. But it's hard to imagine that the large-scale disasters that we are experiencing in the world, at least 4.25 million people have died from COVID, probably closer to 7 or even possibly 8 million people. Such a pandemic must only be arising from the natural consequences of our accumulated wrong actions. And those actions are the result of wrong consciousness. Part of this error is that we probably have totally disregarded that we are part of a greater reality in all kinds of different ways. And so what must be needed here is a consciousness correction, a course correction of our consciousness, and of course starting with our own consciousness. So if our galaxy is primarily Rajasic, we can go one of two directions with that energy. We can go with Sattva Rajas, which is active and good or uplifting qualities. And that's what's sometimes thought of as a archetypal warrior, someone who is doing action, but doing action for the greater good and for helping other people. Or we could head towards Rajasic energy, active, that's tamasic, that is active but materialistic energy. And they both have their certain places in daily living and economic organization and all that. But we probably need to lean into the more expansive consciousness. Now, 14 months ago, our spiritual directors, Jyotish and Devi, put out a call to action. And that call to action was for us to be warriors of light. And I think most people on this path have a tendency that your inherent natural tendencies are to be like warriors. It is a path of service, after all, and service and thinking about the greater good and thinking about helping other people is part of that warrior mentality. Yogananda says warriors are people who like to be active, to fight for a cause, to defend their country, and to protect the defenseless and the weak. Now, also about 14 months ago, last June, I read a letter to the editor from a combat veteran who was talking about, you remember at that time there was a lot of struggle in the society about whether you should wear masks or not. And he wrote a letter talking about why he wore a mask, because it was a natural extension of his training as a warrior, as a soldier, and that he was trained to protect his fellow soldiers, to protect people around him, and that, of course, it made sense that he would wear a mask, not just to protect himself, but to protect other people. And that's part of what the warrior consciousness would naturally lead us to think. Most of us on this path, I think, have a very predominant warrior consciousness. Most people who persist on this path, one way that I know that is because people who've had terrible things happen in their lives, people in this room, people online, people in our congregation, I know have had just terrible things happen in their lives. Their husband dies all of a sudden prematurely, or their daughter is killed, at 20 years old. just horrible things. And the warrior consciousness allows you to not get into this thing of bargaining with God. Why did God let me down? That's the merchant consciousness. I'll give you something and you give me something in return, God. People have persisted. I just know that that's the quality of this congregation. So also about 14 months ago, for some reason the vibrations from last June have come to my mind. Asha, one of our ministers in Palo Alto, she said in June of last year, if we imagine that the pandemic will go away when the vaccine comes, we're not really thinking very clearly. Well, I hate to admit that I was one of those who imagined that when the vaccine comes, that would be kind of a no-brainer and end or help bring to a pretty quick end this pandemic. But a vaccine is not a substitute for consciousness change. In my work, in the circles that I run in, I train people in healthcare. I work in healthcare and academics. We're really vested in the virus being defeated by the vaccine. And I hear a lot of frustration from my coworkers and people in clinics that I talk to about people who don't get the vaccine. But I cannot be a warrior of consciousness if I'm feeling victimized because my plan or my hopes or my desires that this vaccine would end, that the epidemic would end because of this vaccine is being spoiled. In other words, it's not my plan, it's Divine Mother's plan. Whatever is happening, whatever we're in the midst of, is Divine Mother's plan. And to the extent that I feel anger towards people who aren't vaccinated, I don't particularly feel that myself, but I hear this from people I work with. You know, I'm feeling angry these days, and you know, to that extent, where does anger usually arise from? It usually arises from our thwarted desires, our desires that, and you know, I'm as weary of this pandemic as everybody else. But it occurs to me that this pandemic, or this cataclysm of which the pandemic may only be one piece of it, is not over yet. And you know, when Yogananda talked about this terrible cataclysm that he said was coming, he said that we likely couldn't do much about it. And I think he meant much about preventing it from coming. But he said we could always mitigate what comes if we practice spiritual principles. He said you must provide for your own safety and plan to assist anyone that you can. When I think about the scale of the problems that we're having, the economic impacts, the greed, the corruption, the uncaring attitude towards the environment, the uncaring attitude towards others, called immigrants sometimes, all these disturbances may be connected. And in saying that we maybe have not seen the worst of it, I don't mean to be pessimistic, but I do mean to take away our wishful thinking, because wishful thinking is not the same as positive thinking. We could actually think in the sense that if Divine Mother is knocking at the door of our consciousness about something that needs to change on a worldwide scale, then we have to incorporate these inconvenient truths And that's not negative necessarily, that's positive. I'm positive that Divine Mother wants us to learn something from this. And we're told in the readings that these truths that we're trying to realize can't be figured out. One of our Gaurbais in Assisi wrote recently that we can't figure it out, we have to figure it in. And that's true, that consciousness has to come from within us. Because these problems are here to be solved. They're not problems that are here to just make us victims. We are disciples of a great master, a great avatar. We have tools to bring our own consciousness upward. We have tools to help us arrive at the consciousness so we aren't, especially in Ananda, we're a small enough community. We have people who can't get vaccinated or won't get vaccinated perhaps. And instead of hearing them out, which we need to do, we need to find where their consciousness is. We could have those of us who are vaccinated have done it strictly out of fear. So the action of what we do is much less important than the consciousness which we treat each other. And to the extent that our connection with each other, which is, again, the connection with all, is the larger truth that we're trying to realize here, to the extent that that's interrupted by our feelings about one of the tools that we might have at our disposal, the virus or the masks or distancing or hand cleaning, these are all just tools for us. The bigger picture is that we're trying to reach, as Swami said in the reading that Devaki read, the self-expansion of the spirit that's of sympathy, of love, of the awareness that comes with seeing God's presence everywhere. So let's do what we always do well at Ananda. Number one, take care of our own business of raising our consciousness, moving towards self-realization. And number two, helping others to find their highest potential. Thank you. Amen.